Which unsolved mystery are you most interested in? Story 1. The Chamber Beneath the Sphinx. What's actually down there, and why can't we look? The idea of a hidden chamber beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza has circulated in various forms for decades, ranging from legitimate seismic survey data to full-blown esoteric theories about a hall of records containing the lost knowledge of Atlantis. The legitimate version is genuinely interesting on its own terms and doesn't require any mystical scaffold to be worth taking seriously. In the early 1990s, a team of researchers using seismic refraction and ground-penetrating radar surveyed the rock beneath and around the Sphinx and reported anomalies consistent with cavities in the bedrock, voids or chambers in locations that don't correspond to the naturally occurring limestone geology. This wasn't fringe research. It was published and peer-reviewed. The Egyptian authorities subsequently denied permission for any drilling or further invasive investigation, citing the risk of damage to the monument. Their caution is not unreasonable. The Sphinx is constructed from relatively soft limestone that is genuinely vulnerable to mishandled excavation, and the site sits within one of the most politically and symbolically charged archaeological zones on the planet. The decision to not dig is defensible. It is also the decision that leaves the question permanently open, because ground-penetrating radar can identify anomalies but cannot tell you what they contain, whether a natural void, a previously unknown tomb, a water channel, or the entirely mundane geological irregularity that most Egyptologists expect. The frustrating reality is that the mystery might be resolved within weeks with modern, minimally invasive survey equipment. The political and bureaucratic reality is that it almost certainly won't be resolved anytime soon. What is below the Sphinx, and whether it's anything at all beyond limestone and old sand, is a mystery maintained not by the limits of available technology, but by the considerably more complicated limits of permission. Story 2. The Gardner Museum Heist. $500 million of art still missing after 3 decades. In the early hours of March 18, 1990, 2 men dressed as police officers knocked on the service entrance of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, told the security guard they were responding to a disturbance, and were let inside. They then handcuffed both guards to pipes in the basement, spent approximately 81 minutes inside the museum, and walked out carrying 13 works of art, including 3 Rembrandts, a Vermeer, a Manet, and 5 Degas drawings. No alarm was raised until the morning shift arrived. The thieves were never identified. The art has never been recovered. The theft remains the largest property crime in recorded history by estimated value. The museum has maintained a standing offer of $10 million for information leading to the art's recovery, no questions asked, for over 30 years. Empty frames still hang in the museum where the stolen works once were. A deliberate choice by the institution, equal parts memorial and unsolved case board. The FBI has developed theories over the decades: organized crime connections, possible links to figures in the Boston Irish mob, the possibility the art crossed international borders in the years following the theft. Names have been attached to the case by investigators and journalists at various points. None have led to recovered paintings. Some suspects died, taking whatever they knew with them. The 10-year statute of limitations on the theft has long since expired, meaning anyone who returns the art faces no prosecution, only the civil dispute over ownership, which the museum has stated it would navigate case by case. The Vermeer, the concert, is widely considered the most culturally significant missing artwork in the world. It's out there somewhere, in a basement, in a shipping container, behind a wall, in a collection no one is allowed to see. Somewhere, after 34 years, that somewhere remains completely unknown. Story 3. D.B. Cooper, the only unsolved skyjacking in American aviation history. On November 24, 1971, a man who gave his name as Dan Cooper purchased a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Flight 305 from Portland to Seattle, calmly hijacked the plane mid-flight by claiming to have a bomb, negotiated for $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. released all passengers once the plane landed in Seattle, and then somewhere over the dense wilderness of southwest Washington state, opened the rear stairs of the Boeing 727 in flight and jumped. He was never found. No confirmed body, no confirmed identity, no confirmed fate. The FBI case, officially NORJAC for Northwest Jacking, became the longest-running investigation in FBI history, formally suspended in 2016 after 45 years without resolution, though the FBI still accepts tips. The case generated hundreds of suspects over 5 decades, most dismissed fairly quickly, none confirmed. The only physical evidence recovered was a bundle of deteriorated ransom bills found in 1980 along the Columbia River, which confirmed that at least some of the money had been in that general area, but left every other question open: whether Cooper survived the jump, where he went, who he actually was. The jump itself was made in November, at night, in rain, over rugged, heavily forested terrain, at speeds and altitudes that most parachutists consider suicidal without proper equipment. Investigators who interviewed professional skydivers with military parachuting experience over the years have come to varying conclusions about survivability. Most lean toward Cooper not having survived. But without a body, the conclusion is inference rather than evidence. The cultural mythology around D.B. Cooper, folk hero, criminal mastermind, ghost, has outlived the investigation itself. The name Dan Cooper was a misprint in early press coverage, derived from the flight manifest. The real name, if there is one, is still unknown. Story 4, the 1962 Alcatraz escape. 3 men, a rubber raft, and no confirmed deaths. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary sat on an island in San Francisco Bay and was specifically chosen as a maximum security facility, partly because of the assumption that the frigid, fast-moving water surrounding it made successful escape essentially impossible. In June 1962, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin tested that assumption and may have proved it wrong. The escape they engineered was genuinely extraordinary in its methodical detail. Over months of work conducted during their designated recreation periods, the 3 men used sharpened spoon handles and improvised drills made from motor parts to chip away at the ventilation grills behind their cells, which led to a maintenance corridor. They built realistic papier mech dummy heads, painted to a convincing skin tone with hair collected from the prison barbershop, and placed them in their beds under blankets. On the night of June 11, they climbed through the ventilation shaft to the roof, descended to ground level, and made for the water using a raft and life vests improvised from prison-issued raincoats, inflated with an improvised bellows. They were not discovered missing until the following morning. An intensive search of the bay, the surrounding coastline, and the region found nothing conclusive. A small plastic bag containing personal effects belonging to one of the Anglins was found floating in the bay. A fragment of a homemade paddle. Some evidence on Angel Island suggesting someone may have come ashore. No bodies. The FBI officially declared all 3 presumed dead by drowning in 1979. The conclusion most likely based on the statistical improbability of surviving the water conditions that night. The U.S. Marshals Service kept the case open until 2015. A piece of evidence in recent years, a photograph that investigators considered potentially showing the Anglins alive in Brazil in the 1970s, was never conclusively authenticated. The official position is death by drowning. The absence of bodies keeps the door technically open. Story 5, MH370. The plane that vanished with 239 people and left almost no explanation. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 departed Kuala Lumpur on March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing. It carried 227 passengers and 12 crew. Approximately 40 minutes into the flight, while crossing the South China Sea, its transponder stopped transmitting. Military radar tracked it turning westward off its planned course, back across the Malaysian peninsula, and then out over the Indian Ocean. Satellite data placed it somewhere along one of 2 corridors, north or south, hours later. That is, with some qualification, essentially the complete list of confirmed facts. The Southern Corridor Search, which the investigating countries focused on based on the most plausible Doppler analysis of the satellite pings, covered an enormous section of the southern Indian Ocean over multiple years at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. A wing component confirmed as a flaperon from MH370's specific model was found washed ashore on Runyon Island in 2015, along with additional debris pieces subsequently found on the coasts of Mozambique, Madagascar, and South Africa. The debris confirmed the aircraft is in the Indian Ocean. It did not identify where. The central mystery compounds itself. Why did the plane change course? The transponder shutdown was deliberate. Someone with access to the cockpit systems turned it off. Whether this was a pilot in a state of psychological crisis, a hijacker, or some other actor acting under circumstances nobody has been able to reconstruct, the investigation has never produced a confirmed theory. All known passengers and crew have been investigated without finding a compelling motive for deliberate diversion. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, which would likely answer most of the remaining questions, are somewhere on the ocean floor, in an area that has not yet been searched. 239 people disappeared completely. The investigation is the largest maritime search in history. The answer is at the bottom of an ocean, and nobody can get to it. Story 6, Area 51. What we know is interesting enough without the aliens. The genuine frustration with the Area 51 question is that the documented reality, a classified Air Force facility that has been used to test some of the most remarkable aircraft ever built, is itself fascinating. And yet the classified nature of the remaining programs means the question of what's there right now is legitimately unanswerable, which is exactly the gap that more dramatic theories fill. What we know is already extraordinary. The U-2 spy plane, capable of flying at 70,000 feet, altitudes that gave civilian and military pilots no conventional explanation for what they were seeing, which drove decades of UFO reports, was developed and tested at Area 51 from the mid-1950s onward. The SR-71 Blackbird, still the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever to have flown operationally, capable of exceeding Mach 3, was also developed there. The A-12 Oxcart, the SR-71's predecessor, and in some ways its superior, was an engineering achievement that remains astonishing by any standard. All of these were classified for years and generated genuine UFO reports from people who had no frame of reference for what they were observing. The CIA declassified documents in 2013 confirming the facility's existence and its historical function. This confirmed something that had been public knowledge for decades, but never officially acknowledged. What the documents did not confirm is what current programs at the facility involve, because those programs remain classified. So, Area 51 definitely exists. It has historically been used to develop classified aircraft dramatically ahead of anything publicly acknowledged. It almost certainly continues to be used for classified programs whose nature we don't know. The aliens thing specifically has no documented evidential basis. The interest in the facility is entirely justified. What you're most likely to find there is the next generation of technology that will generate UFO reports for the next 30 years, not extraterrestrial visitors. And that's genuinely interesting enough on its own. Story 7, The Money Pit. The Oak Island hole that has swallowed 2 centuries of treasure hunters, the Money Pit on Oak Island, Nova Scotia, has been drawing treasure hunters since at least 1795, when a teenager named Daniel McGinnis reportedly found a circular depression in the ground and, upon digging, discovered a series of log platforms at regular depth intervals, suggesting deliberate, engineered concealment. The search has since consumed enormous amounts of money, effort, and at least 6 lives, and has produced no confirmed treasure, considerable additional mystery, and one of the longest-running obsessive quests in North American history. What makes the Money Pit genuinely strange, beyond the basic premise of an engineered underground shaft, is the flood trap problem. As diggers have gone deeper over the centuries, the pit has repeatedly flooded at specific depths, in a way that investigators over multiple generations have attributed to deliberately engineered flood tunnels connecting the pit to the sea at low tide. A design so sophisticated that it has defeated 2 centuries of excavation attempts with essentially pre-modern and early industrial tools. More recent digs using modern equipment have found similar flooding problems and have additionally uncovered items at various depths that defy obvious explanation. A coconut husk in a region where coconuts don't grow, pieces of gold chain, oak platforms, and what various investigators have interpreted as evidence of genuinely large-scale, deliberate, sophisticated engineering. The theories about what's at the bottom range from the historically plausible treasure, specifically Captain Kidd's, who operated in the Atlantic in the right array, to the grandly improbable Fantas Drake's treasure, Shakespeare's original manuscripts proving Baconian authorship, the Holy Grail. The most defensible position is that something was deliberately concealed there using engineering sophisticated enough to defeat recovery for over 200 years. What exactly that something is remains genuinely unknown, including the possibility that centuries of flooding and collapse have already destroyed or dispersed whatever was originally there. Story 8, Jack the Ripper. Why the most famous unsolved murder case is still actually unsolved. Jack the Ripper killed at least 5 women in the Whitechapel district of London in the autumn of 1888, possibly more, depending on which cases you include in the canonical series, and was never identified, caught, or conclusively linked to any named suspect despite an investigation that generated hundreds of police files, multiple suspects, and one of the most sustained cold case investigative communities in criminal history. The case's persistent cultural fascination stems from several things operating simultaneously. The murders were extraordinarily brutal and occurred in a specific, documented historical time and place that has been preserved in extraordinary detail. Newspaper coverage, police records, inquest testimony, letters, and geographical records that allow researchers to reconstruct Whitechapel 1888 with unusual precision. The lack of any resolution creates the perfect perpetually open narrative, and the suspect pool has been continuously refreshed by successive generations of researchers who have proposed everyone from Queen Victoria's physician to Lewis Carroll to the Duke of Clarence, giving the case the strange quality of being both cold and perpetually current. The genuine forensic situation is that the physical evidence that could theoretically resolve the case, anything that might yield Dina, is fragmentary, contaminated, and contested. A shawl allegedly found at one of the murder scenes and now owned by a private collector has been the subject of multiple Dina analyses over the years, each generating headlines and each subsequently challenged on methodology. No analysis has produced results that the broader research community considers conclusive. The most honest answer to who was Jack the Ripper is that we don't know, that we may never know, and that the suspect list running to hundreds of names over 136 years tells you more about the psychology of mystery and pattern seeking than it tells you about Victorian London's most notorious killer. Story 9, Damascus Steel. The lost metallurgical secret that made the best blades in the medieval world Damascus steel. The blade material produced in the Islamic world from roughly the 3rd to the 17th century say, characterized by its distinctive watered or whorled patterning, exceptional edge retention, and a combination of hardness and flexibility that European swordsmiths of the period could not reliably replicate, represents one of the most intriguing examples of a technology being completely lost to history, despite being the product of human craft rather than natural phenomenon. The basic material was wood steel, made from specific ore sources primarily in South India and Sri Lanka, smelted under controlled conditions that produced a steel containing unusually high carbon content in a form. Cementite carbides arranged in particular patterns that gave it properties different from conventional high-carbon steel. How exactly the medieval smiths of the Levant processed this material into Damascus blades with their characteristic banding and properties is what remains unknown, because the knowledge appears to have died with the last practitioners of the specific technique. The technique's disappearance is usually attributed to the disruption of the trade routes supplying the specific Indian ore. What's made from other iron sources apparently does not produce the same results. Combined with the political and demographic upheavals of the 17th and 18th centuries that broke the master-apprentice chains through which the craft knowledge was transmitted. By the time European metallurgists and historians began seriously trying to understand Damascus steel in the 19th century, the people who knew how to make it were gone. Modern metallurgical analysis has established a great deal about what Damascus steel contains. Carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires have been identified in historical blade samples, structures that would not be predicted by conventional metallurgical theory, and that the medieval smiths certainly couldn't have deliberately engineered at the nanoscale. They achieved a result we can analyze, but not fully explain or reliably reproduce. The recipe is gone. Story 10: The Voynich Manuscript. 600 years of failure to read a single sentence. The Voynich Manuscript is a handwritten, illustrated book, carbon dated to approximately 1404-1438, written in a script that no one has ever identified or deciphered, containing illustrations of plants that don't correspond to any identified species, astronomical diagrams, human figures in small pools connected by what look like anatomical tubes, and sections whose content and purpose remain completely unknown. Every serious decipherment attempt in its history, and there have been many, by cryptographers, linguists, historians, and computer scientists, has either been debunked or remains unconfirmed. The script, called Voynichese, has statistical properties that make it behave like a natural language. It follows Zipf's law, has word-length distributions consistent with real languages, and shows internal regularities that don't match known encoding techniques of the period. This has led most researchers to conclude it is not a simple substitution cipher of a known language, which is what most period codes were. What it actually is remains unresolved. The plant illustrations specifically have attracted enormous attention, because their identification would be the most direct route to understanding the manuscript's content and purpose. If you could identify the plants, you'd know what category of knowledge the manuscript is concerned with. None of the dozens of illustrated plants clearly match any known species, though various researchers have proposed partial identifications for individual illustrations. Whether the plants are real plants poorly rendered, invented plants in a fictional herbology, symbolic representations, or something else entirely is unknown. The manuscript's provenance before the early 17th century is unknown. It may have been produced as a genuine work in an unknown language, as an elaborate hoax, though the carbon dating makes a post-medieval hoax impossible, as a work in a deliberately invented language, or as something nobody has yet imagined. After more than 6 centuries, we cannot read a single confirmed word. Story 11: The Dyatlov Pass Incident. 9 hikers who ran out of a tent into a snowstorm and died in January 1959. A group of 9 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute established camp on the eastern slope of a mountain in the northern Ural range of the Soviet Union, a location later named Dyatlov Pass for their leader, Igor Dyatlov. Sometime during the night of February 1, something caused all 9 of them to cut or tear their way out of the tent from the inside and run into sub-zero temperatures in various states of undress, without their full cold weather gear. They all died. Hypothermia claimed most of them, but the circumstances were not consistent with simple panic or confusion. The tent had been cut from the inside, suggesting a deliberate rather than frantic exit. The group had split, with some dying near the tree line apparently attempting to start a fire, and others found much later in a ravine with injuries that confounded the initial investigators. 3 of the 9 had severe internal traumatic injuries, fractured ribs, a fractured skull, with the tissue damage inconsistent with blunt external force, but more consistent with a massive compressive force. 1 was missing her tongue and eyes. Soviet authorities closed the investigation in 1959 with the conclusion that an unknown compelling force had caused the deaths, which is less an explanation than an admission of failure. The case reopened in Russia in 2019 and officially concluded in 2020 with the attribution of the deaths to an avalanche, the compressive injuries being consistent with snow compaction, the flight from the tent being a survival response to the avalanche. Critics of this conclusion note that the terrain at the campsite was not typical avalanche terrain. No avalanche debris was documented in the original investigation, and several details remain inconsistent with the official explanation. What caused 9 experienced hikers to flee into the cold and die is still, depending on who you ask, either officially resolved or genuinely unknown. Story 12: The Melungeons. The Appalachian community, with an origin nobody could agree on, the Melungeons, are a tri-racial isolate community found historically in the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in the Hancock County region of Tennessee and neighboring areas of Virginia and Kentucky, documented in records from at least the late 18th century as a distinct community of people who were neither categorically white, nor categorically black, nor categorically Native American by the racial classification standards of the time, and whose origin was disputed, mythologized, and debated for over 2 centuries. The documented historical range of theories about Melungeon origin is itself remarkable as an index of how thoroughly uncertain the question was considered. Proposed origins over the years included Portuguese sailors from colonial-era shipwrecks or settlements, Turkish captives sold into slavery, survivors of the lost colony of Roanoke, Phoenician or Carthaginian seafarers who reached North America in antiquity, Cherokee and other indigenous communities, and various combinations of early European settlers, freed African Americans, and indigenous peoples mixing over generations in the colonial-era backcountry. Modern genetic analysis, conducted in a major study published in 2012, provided the most empirically grounded answer the question has received. The tested Melungeon descendants showed primarily Northern European ancestry alongside sub-Saharan African ancestry, with some indigenous Native American ancestry, and no significant evidence of Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, or other exotic origins. The DNA points toward a community formed from the mixing of free or freed African Americans and European settlers in the colonial-era backcountry, a combination that would have been socially stigmatized and whose members might have had compelling reasons to adopt alternate origin stories. The mystery that remains is not so much ethnic origin as social history, how a community formed, maintained its distinct identity, and generated and sustained such an elaborate mythology of exotic origin across generations of American history. Story 13: Cryptos. The CIA sculpture with one unsolved panel that's been waiting 30 years. Cryptos is a large S-shaped copper sculpture installed in 1990 in the courtyard of the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia, created by artist Jim Sanborn in collaboration with a retired CIA cryptographer. It contains 4 encrypted messages totaling approximately 865 characters. 3 of the 4 panels were solved, the first by CIA analysts internally in 1993, and all 3 publicly by cryptographer Jim Gilligos in 1999. The 4th panel, 97 characters long, has never been solved. This is the detail worth sitting with. The 4th panel of a puzzle installed at the headquarters of the world's most sophisticated signals intelligence agency, with access to the world's best cryptanalysts, computers, and institutional code-breaking knowledge, has been unsolved for 34 years. Thousands of dedicated amateur cryptographers have worked on it. Jim Sanborn has remained alive and has occasionally provided hints, most notably that the plain text of panel 4 contains the word Berlin, and more recently that it contains the letters NIPTIT, which decrypt to Berlin. These hints have not enabled a full solution. The approaches that have been ruled out or explored without success include standard cipher types, linguistic frequency analysis, numerical pattern recognition, and various interpretations of how panel 4 might relate to the solved portions of the other panels. What most analysts believe, based on the hints and the structure of the solved panels, is that the 4th panel's plaintext refers to something specific, a location, an event, a name, But without the starting foothold a complete decryption would provide, the specific reference remains inaccessible. Sanborn has stated that if he dies before the puzzle is solved, he has made arrangements for the solution to be disclosed. The puzzle is, currently, still unsolved. Story 14, the Zodiac Killer, 5 confirmed murders, multiple ciphers, and 0 confirmed identity. The Zodiac Killer murdered at least 5 people in Northern California between December 1968 and October 1969, though he claimed in taunting letters to have killed 37 and was never identified or caught. What made the case distinctly different from other serial murder cases of the period was the killer's direct, active engagement with the press and police through a series of letters and ciphers sent to Bay Area newspapers containing clues, taunts, and encrypted messages, some of which have been solved and some of which remain open. The most famous cipher, the 408 symbol message sent in 3 parts to 3 newspapers in July 1969, was solved within a week by a schoolteacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Hardin, decrypting to a message written in the killer's voice about the pleasure of killing and his belief that those he killed would become his slaves in the afterlife. The 340 character cipher, sent 2 months later, remained unsolved for 51 years before a team of amateur cryptographers cracked it in December 2020, revealing a message mostly consistent with the voice and content of the 408 cipher. The identity question has attracted an enormous investigative community, both professional and amateur, producing hundreds of named suspects and several major reinvestigations. In 2021, an independent research group called the Case Breakers publicly named a deceased Air Force veteran as their prime suspect, generating significant media coverage. Law enforcement has not confirmed this identification. The original suspect pool from the active investigation included people who were never cleared due to incomplete forensic analysis of the period. The fingerprint evidence, the handwriting, the DNA from saliva on envelope seals, all of these exist. None have produced a confirmed match in any suspect to date, leaving the most documented, most communicated, and most culturally embedded serial murder case in American history, formally unresolved. Story 15, the Wow. Signal, 72 seconds of something that has never been explained or repeated. On August 15, 1977, astronomer Jerry Amon, working on a SETI project at Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope, detected an unusually strong narrowband radio signal from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. The signal lasted approximately 72 seconds, the duration of a single observation pass of the telescope over any given patch of sky, and was so far outside the noise baseline that Amon circled it on the computer printout and wrote "Wow" in the margin. The signal has never been detected again, despite numerous targeted and general searches. The specific properties of the signal are what make it genuinely remarkable, rather than just anomalous noise. It arrived at 1420 MHz, the frequency of the hydrogen emission line, a frequency considered by SETI researchers to be a logical choice for interstellar communication, because hydrogen is the most common element in the universe, and any technologically sophisticated civilization capable of radio transmission would presumably know its frequency and consider it a natural channel for broadcasting. The signal was narrowband, consistent with an artificial transmission, rather than natural astrophysical phenomena. Its intensity profile was consistent with a point source that the telescope moved over as it tracked the sky, suggesting a fixed, distant origin. Natural explanations have been proposed over the decades: hydrogen clouds, comets, interstellar hydrogen emission, and each has been evaluated and found insufficient to fully account for all the signal's characteristics simultaneously. The most comprehensive natural explanation involves hydrogen emission from comets, proposed by Antonio Paris in 2016, based on 2 comets in the field of view at the time. But this explanation has been challenged by subsequent analysis, suggesting the comet's known emission profiles don't match the signal. The Wow signal is the single strongest candidate for an extraterrestrial artificial radio signal ever detected. It has been observed exactly once, Story 16, the Highway of Tears. Decades of disappearances along a remote Canadian road, Highway 16. The stretch of road running 724 kilometers through the rugged, remote interior of British Columbia between Prince Rupert and Prince George has been the site of the disappearances and deaths of at least 18 women and girls since 1969, with some advocacy estimates suggesting the actual number may be considerably higher when cases not officially linked to the highway are included. The majority of victims are Indigenous women, many from First Nations communities along the route. The highway became known as the Highway of Tears, a name coined by the families and communities of the missing rather than by authorities. The geography of the highway is itself part of the problem. The towns along the route are separated by long stretches of wilderness. Public transportation is limited or non-existent in many stretches, and hitchhiking has historically been a common and often necessary means of transportation for people without vehicles. The remoteness that makes the corridor scenic also makes it extraordinarily dangerous for anyone stranded or in need of a ride. One of the most basic risk factors for violent crime is isolation from witnesses and help. And Highway 16 has both in abundance. Multiple suspects have been investigated over the decades. 2 convicted killers, Bobby Jack Fowler and Johnny Frank Addis, are considered by investigators to have been responsible for some of the cases based on geographic overlap with their confirmed crimes. But multiple deaths and disappearances have no confirmed perpetrator. DNA technology has aided some investigations while leaving others as cold as the case notes from 30 years ago. The under-resourcing of investigations into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, a documented pattern across Canadian law enforcement history, has meant that cases which might have been resolved with more aggressive early investigation were allowed to go cold. Some of them will stay cold. Story 17, JFK, the assassination with one official explanation and several decades of reasonable doubt. The Warren Commission, which conducted the official investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy on November 22, 1963, concluded in 1964 that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, firing 3 shots from the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby 2 days after the assassination, before any trial could occur. The case has generated more investigation, more controversy, and more competing theories than any other event in modern American political history. The physical evidence and witness testimony produced genuinely complicated problems for the single assassin conclusion that have never been fully resolved. The acoustic evidence examined by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, a separate congressional investigation in the late 1970s, led that committee to conclude with high probability that 4 shots were fired, including one from a grassy knoll in front of the presidential motorcade rather than from the book depository behind it. A conclusion inconsistent with the lone gunman theory. That acoustic analysis was subsequently challenged on methodological grounds, and the scientific community is genuinely divided on its reliability. The magic bullet, the single round that the Warren Commission concluded, caused 7 wounds to Kennedy and Governor Connally while following a trajectory that critics have argued is implausible, remains contested. Expert wound ballistics analysts have reached different conclusions about whether the single bullet theory is physically possible given the documented wound locations and the positions of the men at the moment of impact. What is established with certainty? Kennedy was assassinated. Oswald was the prime suspect, and his guilt is supported by substantial evidence. Whether he acted alone, whether other shots were fired, and whether Jack Ruby was connected to a broader conspiracy are questions that the available evidence supports different answers to, and the full documentary record, including materials held by the National Archives, has not been fully released even now. Story 18, the origin of human consciousness and language. The mystery that makes all other mysteries possible, every other mystery on this list, every cipher decoded, every disappearance investigated, every archaeological site excavated, every radio signal analyzed, is the product of minds doing those things. What those minds are, where they came from, and how the specific capacity for language that makes all of this possible emerged is a question that sits so close to what we are that it's almost impossible to examine clearly. The hard problem of consciousness is precisely that there's no obvious reason why physical processes in a brain should produce subjective experience, rather than simply information processing in the dark. Neurons fire, signals propagate, patterns form and dissolve, and somehow, in brains of sufficient complexity, there is something it is like to be that brain. Not just computation happening, but someone experiencing the computation happening. Why experience arises from physics rather than just more physics is a question philosophy and neuroscience have been approaching from multiple directions without producing a consensus resolution. The origin of language adds a second layer. Spoken language leaves no fossil trace. The anatomical prerequisites for complex speech, the descended larynx, fine motor control of tongue and lips, the specific brain regions associated with language production and comprehension can be inferred from skeletal remains with some precision. The cognitive leap from making calls to constructing nested grammatical sentences about hypothetical future events cannot. Human language is so structurally different from other animal communication that its emergence looks, in the fossil record, less like a gradual continuum and more like an event. Something happened around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago that produced a different kind of cognitive creature. What happened is unknown. How consciousness arose from the physical is unknown. These are the questions that all the other questions assume we can ask. Story 19, the Alaskan Triangle. Hundreds of missing people and no pattern that makes sense. Alaska has a per capita missing persons rate dramatically higher than any other U.S. state, roughly 16 per 100,000 people annually, compared to a national average of roughly 4, and a subset of those disappearances concentrated in a broadly defined region of south-central Alaska, sometimes called the Alaskan Triangle between Juneau, Anchorage, and Barrow, have attracted specific attention because of their volume and the frequency with which they produce no recoverable evidence whatsoever. The geographic reality of Alaska accounts for a significant portion of this statistic. The state is enormous, larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined, with vast stretches of wilderness accessible only by small aircraft, populated by bears, wolves, and genuinely severe weather, with search and rescue operations that are logistically and financially catastrophic. People who go missing in remote Alaskan wilderness often simply don't survive and aren't found because the terrain is too vast and too hostile for comprehensive search. This is the most likely explanation for most individual cases. What attracts persistent mystery attention is the specific category of disappearances that defy even this explanation. People who vanish from areas close to roads and settlements, or from small aircraft whose debris is never located despite search efforts that would seem adequate to find a downed plane, or in multiple instances the 1972 disappearance of a small plane carrying then House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, with 2 other politicians and a pilot, that was simply never found despite one of the largest search efforts in Alaskan aviation history at the time. There is no confirmed paranormal explanation for the Alaskan missing persons rate. There is a genuine, documented disproportion between Alaska's disappearances and the national baseline that, even accounting for its wilderness character, remains notable to researchers who study it. Story 20, dark matter. The 27% of the universe that's definitely there and completely unknown dark matter is not a theory about something that might exist. It is a conclusion drawn from multiple independent lines of observational evidence about something that definitely exists, whose nature is completely unknown. The evidence for dark matter is so overwhelming and comes from so many independent directions that virtually no mainstream physicist doubts its existence. What it actually is remains one of the most significant open questions in all of physics. The evidence starts with the rotation curves of galaxies. When astronomers measure how fast stars at different distances from a galaxy's center rotate around that center, The speeds at the outer edges are far higher than they should be based on the visible mass of the galaxy. If only visible matter were present, the outer stars should rotate slowly, like the outer planets of our solar system. They don't. Something is providing additional gravitational mass that isn't emitting or reflecting light, dark matter in the halo surrounding and extending far beyond the visible galaxy. This is confirmed independently by gravitational lensing, the bending of light from distant objects as it passes through intervening mass, which reveals far more mass than visible matter accounts for. It's confirmed by the cosmic microwave background, the radiation from the early universe whose patterns encode information about the matter distribution of the early universe, and which is only consistent with dark matter being present. It's confirmed by the large-scale structure of the universe, the way galaxies cluster into filaments and voids, which simulations can only reproduce if dark matter is present. What dark matter is, what particles it consists of, how it interacts with itself if at all, why it doesn't interact with electromagnetic radiation, is completely unknown. Multiple candidate particles have been proposed and searched for without confirmed detection. The detectors have gotten more sensitive. The candidate particles have not shown up. Story 21, the Basque language. The linguistic island that predates every known European language Basque, Euskara, is one of the most linguistically remarkable facts about Europe and one of the most genuine mysteries in historical linguistics. It is a language isolate. It has no demonstrated genetic relationship to any other living or dead language anywhere in the world. It is surrounded on all sides by Indo-European languages, Spanish, French, and yet it is not Indo-European and never was. It is not related to any pre-Indo-European language whose structure is known from documentary evidence. It appears to be a survivor from before the arrival of the Indo-European languages in Europe, possibly tens of thousands of years old. The Indo-European language family, which includes most European languages as well as Persian and Sanskrit and dozens of others, spread across Eurasia in a process that most linguists date to the Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 years ago, likely carried by people associated with the expansion of pastoralism from the steppe. Whatever languages existed in Europe before that expansion, and there must have been many, spoken by the people who built Stonehenge, who painted the cave art at Altamira, who settled Europe after the last ice age, are essentially unrecoverable, except in one case. Basque is the exception. It survived the replacement of pre-Indo-European languages across Europe because the specific geography of the Basque country, the Western Pyrenees, a region of considerable natural defensibility, allowed the community speaking it to maintain cultural continuity through the Indo-European expansion and everything that followed. What the language encodes about the cognitive and cultural world of its ancient speakers, what it might reveal about pre-Indo-European Europe, and what its relationship to other now-lost language families might have been, are questions that historical linguistics can approach only indirectly. Story 22, Roanoke, the colony that was there and then wasn't the lost colony of Roanoke, is the earliest and in some ways cleanest American disappearance mystery. In 1587, a group of roughly 115 English colonists established a settlement on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, under the direction of John White. White returned to England for supplies almost immediately after the colony was established. The outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War delayed his return. He finally made it back to Roanoke in August 1590, 3 years later, and found the settlement abandoned. The structures had been methodically dismantled rather than destroyed in panic, suggesting an organized departure rather than a violent attack. The only text left behind was carved on a post, Croatoan, the name of a nearby island and a local indigenous people. There was no cross carved above the word, which White had arranged as a distress signal before his departure. White interpreted this as indicating the colonists had moved to Croatoan Island, now Hatteras Island, and attempted to sail there immediately, but was prevented by weather and had to leave. He never returned to America. No English follow-up expedition reached the colonists. The answer they carried, why they moved, how they fared, What happened in 3 years of isolation was never relayed to anyone who could record it. Archaeological excavations over recent decades have found possible evidence of European presence in the interior of North Carolina, some distance from Roanoke, including European artifacts and sites associated with indigenous communities. The most widely accepted scholarly interpretation currently is that the colonists integrated with one or more indigenous communities, either voluntarily or through the kind of absorption that follows a group too weakened to maintain independence. Whether any biological descendants of the 1587 colonists exist in communities today is unknown. Story 23, The Falling Man, One Photograph, One Unknown Person, and One Decision Nobody Made Easily on September 11, 2001. Associated Press photographer Richard Drew captured a photograph of a man falling from the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The image shows a figure in perfect vertical alignment against the tower's geometric facade, head down, one leg slightly bent, in a posture of almost formal stillness that stands in extreme contrast to the circumstances of its capture. The photograph was published in newspapers across the United States the day after the attacks, and then largely suppressed, deemed too disturbing for continued circulation, as public and editorial consensus shifted away from the most direct imagery of the deaths. The photograph is one of the most discussed and debated images in the history of photojournalism. The figure falling, identified in his clothing and posture as a person who worked in the food services at the windows on the World Restaurant at the top of the North Tower, was for years publicly unidentified, part of a broader social and journalistic reluctance to confront the reality that approximately 200 people fell or jumped from the towers that morning, a fact that was experienced as publicly uncomfortable, in a way that the deaths of people trapped in the buildings, equally real and equally impossible, somehow was not. Several families have been contacted over the years by journalists investigating the image's subject, and some have confirmed or denied specific identifications. The most reported identification, a food service worker named Jonathan Briley, was accepted by his family and reported by several journalists. It has not been confirmed by official records in a way that closes the question entirely. The image's subject may or may not be definitively known. What is unambiguous is that the photograph captures a real human being making the last choice, or the only choice, available to them on a specific morning in September, in circumstances they did not choose and could not have imagined. Story 24, Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old temple complex that rewrote prehistory Göbekli Tepe, located in the Taurus Mountain foothills of southeastern Turkey, is a Neolithic archaeological site consisting of multiple rings of massive carved stone pillars, dated to approximately 9600–8200 BC, making it the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, predating Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, and the earliest Egyptian pyramids by similar margins. It was constructed before the invention of writing, before the development of pottery in this region, and, according to standard archaeological chronology, before the development of agriculture. The last point is what rewrote the textbooks. Standard archaeological theory before Göbekli Tepe's excavation held that complex, organized religion requiring significant cooperative labor was a product of settled agricultural societies, that the surplus of food produced by farming enabled specialization, including priests and monument builders. Göbekli Tepe appears to predate settled agriculture in the region by potentially thousands of years, suggesting that the causal relationship might run the other way, that the organizational demands of constructing and maintaining a religious complex may have been what drove the development of agriculture, rather than agriculture enabling the complex. The T-shaped pillars, some standing 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, are decorated with elaborate carvings of animals, foxes, lions, vultures, scorpions, arranged in ways that some researchers interpret as depicting specific celestial alignments or mythological narratives. No text exists to interpret the symbolism. The meanings of the carvings are unknown. Most remarkably, the site appears to have been deliberately buried around 8000 BC, intentionally backfilled with debris rather than simply abandoned, a purposeful concealment that preserved it but also raises the question of why. Why bury a structure of such evident importance? The people who made that decision took the answer with them into a prehistory we cannot read. Story 25, The Fen Treasure. A 42-pound chest buried somewhere in the Rockies Forest Fen was an art dealer and author from Santa Fe, New Mexico, who in 2010 published a memoir containing a 24-line poem he claimed provided precise directions to a chest he had personally hidden somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, north of Santa Fe, above 5,000 feet elevation. The chest contained gold coins, gold nuggets, gemstones, jewelry, and pre-Columbian artifacts, with an estimated value of around $2 million. He invited anyone who could solve the poem to go find it. For 10 years, an estimated 350,000 people searched for the chest, following their interpretations of 9 clues embedded in the poem. Fen occasionally confirmed some interpretations and corrected others without revealing additional location information. At least 5 searchers died in the search, mostly in wilderness accidents. The FBI investigated the legitimacy of the treasure and apparently satisfied themselves it was real. Multiple books were written about the search. A documentary series was produced. In June 2020, Fen announced that the treasure had been found by a man from back east who identified himself only as wanting to remain anonymous. Fen confirmed the find was genuine and that the chest had indeed been found at the location described by the poem in Wyoming. He died 3 months later, at age 90. The mystery that remains is what the poem actually said and where the chest was, which the anonymous finder has declined to reveal, and which Fen took to his grave. The treasure itself is resolved. It was found. The location, and therefore the answer to how the poem decoded, remains private. A second intellectual mystery sits inside the resolved physical one. How did the poem describe a specific place? And what were the 9 clues? 10 years of searching, hundreds of thousands of people, and the answer was apparently knowable from the text. Nobody who knows has told us. Story 26, The Serious Mystery. An African tribe's knowledge of a star they shouldn't have known about the Dogon people of Mali and West Africa have been studied by anthropologists since the 1930s, when Marcel Griaule and Germaine Dieterlen documented their cosmological and mythological system in extensive fieldwork. What made the Dogon case specifically remarkable to certain researchers, and what became the basis of Robert Temple's 1976 book The Serious Mystery, was the claim that Dogon traditional knowledge contained detailed and accurate astronomical information about the star Sirius that should have been impossible without modern instrumentation. Specifically, the claim is that Dogon tradition accurately describes Sirius as a binary star system, that the companion star B is dense and small, that Sirius B orbits Sirius A with a 50-year orbital period, and that the system involves a third star, Sirius C. Sirius B is real. It is a white dwarf companion to Sirius A. Its existence was not confirmed by Western astronomy until 1862, when telescopic observations first resolved it, and its orbit and density were not characterized precisely until the 20th century. Sirius C's existence remains disputed. The central question is how Dogon tradition came to contain this information. Temple's hypothesis was direct contact with extraterrestrial beings from the Sirius system in ancient history. Skeptical anthropologists have offered several alternative explanations: that the relevant Dogon astronomical knowledge was contaminated by contact with Western astronomers before Griaule's fieldwork, that Griaule's documentation reflects his own interpretive framework being imposed on less precise Dogon cosmology, or that the oral traditions recorded have been misidentified or mistranslated. Subsequent anthropologists have found inconsistency in Dogon communities' knowledge of the specific astronomical details, suggesting the information may not be as uniformly distributed across the tradition as Griaule implied. The question of origin, whatever the information actually was, remains actively debated. Story 27, The Art Bell Phone Call. When a radio broadcast was cut off mid-confession, Art Bell hosted Coast to Coast AM. the late-night paranormal talk radio program that at its peak reached millions of listeners across North America. And the program's format, open phone lines, anonymous callers, extended unscreened conversations at 2 a.m, produced what may be its single most famous moment in 1997, a call that has been replayed and analyzed online for decades. A caller, sounding genuinely distressed and afraid, told Bell he was a former Area 51 employee who had been recently discharged and was terrified for his life. He claimed that what the government was hiding at Area 51 was not simply advanced aircraft, but extraterrestrial beings, and that these beings were not benevolent, but were interdimensional in nature and were not what they claimed to be. He described himself as being located outdoors and said he believed he was being tracked and triangulated in real time. Then, mid-sentence, the broadcast went dead. The satellite uplink transmitting the show failed. The technical failure lasted several minutes. When the broadcast resumed, Art Bell explained that the satellite connection had been interrupted, a technical failure that he noted was extremely unusual given the show's infrastructure. The original caller never called back or was never identified. The appeal of this story is the timing. The satellite failing in the moment a caller claims to be revealing classified information about government surveillance feels like narrative confirmation, the universe providing a dramatic full stop. The skeptical reading is that Art Bell, who was an extremely skilled radio host, and his callers, who had strong incentives to be entertaining, were together producing compelling radio through a combination of genuine caller emotion, skilled interview technique, and an equipment failure that happened to coincide perfectly. Both things are true in their respective registers. The caller was never identified. Story 28, Oak Island. The engineering mystery that's been defeating people since 1795. This entry would be Story 7 territory if that weren't already the Money Pit specifically. Oak Island is the Money Pit, and the two names refer to the same site, though Oak Island as a name encompasses the broader island, the broader search history, and the television franchise that has brought renewed attention and considerable new excavation to the site over the past decade. The fundamental Oak Island puzzle is an engineering one as much as a treasure one. Whoever created the shaft and its apparent flood tunnel defenses, if they were created deliberately rather than naturally formed, did so using engineering knowledge sophisticated enough that multiple centuries of treasure hunters, using the best available technology of their respective eras, have been unable to recover whatever is there. This is either evidence of genuinely remarkable pre-modern engineering, or evidence that the flood tunnels are natural rather than artificial, and the shaft itself contains less than centuries of accumulated mythology suggest. Recent excavations by the Legina brothers and their team, documented in extensive detail through the History Channel series, have produced genuine, puzzling artifacts, ancient coins, Spanish moraved from the 16th century, a medieval cross, a possible piece of parchment found very deep in the shaft. These finds are either extraordinary evidence of pre-Columbian contact and concealment, or the result of contaminated stratigraphy from centuries of prior digging, bringing material from upper layers down to apparent deep deposits. The most plausible candidates for who created the shaft, if it was created deliberately, include pirates operating in the Atlantic in the late 17th and early 18th century, Spanish or French colonial forces concealing valuables during periods of conflict, or English Masonic or similar fraternal organizations engaged in some form of ritual concealment. The evidence doesn't conclusively support any of these over the others. Story 29, the Black Monolith Puzzle. The mysterious challenge almost nobody has heard of the Black Monolith is a puzzle created by an anonymous individual or group, circulated primarily through specific online communities devoted to difficult puzzles and cryptographic challenges, and is considered by those who track such things to be one of the more genuinely difficult unsolved puzzles currently active, notable for its obscurity even within the niche communities where it's discussed. This category of puzzle, elaborate, deliberately obscure challenges created by anonymous parties and distributed through channels that ensure only specific, highly motivated communities find them, has a documented history in internet culture the most famous example being Cicada 3301, a series of extraordinarily complex cryptographic puzzles that appeared between 2012 and 2014, incorporating ciphers, steganography, ancient music notation, and physical location challenges across multiple continents, and that were solved only partially by collaborative teams of highly capable cryptographers and programmers, with the final solution and the identity of the creators never publicly confirmed. The Black Monolith, if it fits within this tradition, likely combines multiple domains of knowledge: mathematics, cryptography, history, literature, or science, in a way that makes individual expertise insufficient and requires collaborative synthesis. This format is specifically compelling to communities that value intellectual challenge for its own sake, regardless of what, if anything, awaits at the solution. What distinguishes the most successful puzzles in this genre from simple difficult problems is the architecture of revelation. Each solved layer reveals not just an answer, but a new puzzle, making the experience feel less like solving a crossword and more like descending into a building whose floor plan you discover room by room. The Black Monolith remains, for most people, in the category of things they've heard about but haven't found. Story 30: The Mary Celeste. The ship found sailing without a crew, and with breakfast still on the table, the Mary Celeste is the vessel being described here, discovered adrift in the Atlantic Ocean on December 4, 1872, by the crew of the Dei Gratia, which had departed New York 8 days after the Mary Celeste on the same transatlantic route. The Mary Celeste was found in good seaworthy condition with sails set, steering properly. No sign of fire or violence, no sign of piracy or sea monster or anything obviously explanatory. 10 people had been aboard: Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew. None were ever found. The ship's cargo, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, was largely intact. The personal belongings of the crew and passengers remained on board. The navigational instruments were in their places. The ship's papers were missing, as was the lifeboat, suggesting a planned rather than panic-driven departure. But there is no recorded explanation for why the departure was considered necessary. The breakfast on the table detail, like many famous embellishments of this case, does not appear in the original inquiry records and was probably added in subsequent retellings. What is documented is that the ship appeared to have been abandoned in haste without obvious cause, with provisions intact and no evidence of disaster sufficient to explain why experienced sailors would leave a seaworthy vessel in open ocean. The most plausible explanation developed by historians and maritime experts over the years involves the industrial alcohol cargo. Denatured alcohol can produce dangerous fumes, and a concern about potential explosion could have caused the captain to order everyone into the lifeboat to trail behind the ship, waiting for the fumes to clear, with the tow rope subsequently parting in rough weather. If this is what happened, the lifeboat was lost at sea, and the ship sailed on unmanned. The explanation is plausible. It was never confirmed. Story 31, the hardest unsolved math problem, the Riemann hypothesis, has been open for 165 years. The Riemann hypothesis, first proposed by Bernhard Riemann in 1859, is widely considered the most important unsolved problem in mathematics. It concerns the distribution of prime numbers, the counting numbers divisible only by themselves in 1, and makes a specific, precise claim about the location of the non-trivial zeros of a complex function called the Riemann zeta function. That sentence requires considerable mathematical background to fully parse, but the implications are enormous and touch the foundations of number theory, cryptography, and our deepest understanding of how numbers actually behave. The Clay Mathematics Institute lists it as one of the 7 Millennium Prize problems, each carrying a $1 million prize for a solution. Only one of the 7 has ever been solved. The Riemann hypothesis is not that one. What makes this problem both compelling and frustrating is the combination of clear statement and complete resistance to proof. The hypothesis is not vague. It makes a precise, testable claim. Computing has verified it for the first 10 trillion non-trivial zeros of the zeta function. It has held up against every numerical test ever applied to it. Every working mathematician who has thought carefully about it believes it is almost certainly true. No one has proven it. The proof, if it comes, will require genuinely new mathematics, new techniques, new frameworks, possibly new ways of thinking about the relationship between continuous and discrete mathematical structures. Every approach that has been tried on the Riemann hypothesis has eventually stalled. Some of the stalls have produced genuinely valuable mathematics in their own right. The prize remains uncollected. The hypothesis remains unproven. The primes continue to distribute themselves in the pattern that everyone believes is described by the hypothesis, for reasons that nobody has yet been able to explain with the rigor that proof requires. Story 32 Skinwalker Ranch. Whatever's happening there has attracted military and academic attention. Skinwalker Ranch is a 512-acre property in the Uinta Basin of Utah, with a documented history of reported anomalous phenomena stretching back at least several decades, including claims of UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, poltergeist activity, crop circle formation, and encounters with entities described by witnesses in terms ranging from wolves to shapeshifters to things they had no framework to describe. The name references Navajo folklore concerning malevolent shapeshifting beings, though the connection between the folklore entity and whatever is reportedly occurring at the ranch is not established. What elevates this beyond ordinary rural paranormal claims is the documented involvement of serious institutional researchers. Robert Bigelow, the aerospace entrepreneur with documented ties to government UAP research, purchased the ranch in 1996 through the National Institute for Discovery Science specifically to conduct formal investigation. His team included credentialed physicists and other scientists who produced internal reports about the phenomena they encountered, reports that have never been fully made public. Bigelow subsequently sold the ranch in 2016 to Adamantium Holdings, with continued research and the television series following. The ranch also appears in the documented history of government UAP research. It was visited or investigated by people connected to the ATIP program, the now confirmed Pentagon UAP research effort. The specific connection has not been fully disclosed, but the intersection of a purported paranormal hotspot with a program that subsequently received congressional attention is not nothing. The phenomena being reported at Skinwalker Ranch are either genuine and extraordinary, or an elaborate, sustained combination of misidentification, suggestion, and motivated perception operating on researchers whose investment in finding something gives them incentive to find it. Both possibilities are genuinely interesting for different reasons. Story 33 Human Consciousness. The mystery that makes every other mystery mysterious, everything that makes a mystery interesting. The unsettled feeling, the desire to know, the sense that something important is just out of reach, is a product of consciousness. The investigator staring at an unsolved cipher, the detective walking through an abandoned building, the astronomer listening to a radio signal at 1420 megahertz. All of these are experiences of a conscious being, and what consciousness is, where it comes from, and why it exists at all are questions that don't have a satisfying answer. This has come up already in this collection, but it deserves its own full treatment because it's genuinely different from the other entries. Every other mystery on this list is, in principle, resolvable by gathering more information. Enough surveillance footage, enough genetic analysis, enough archaeological excavation, enough mathematical effort, and JFK's assassination, the Voynich manuscript, the Riemann hypothesis, all could in principle be resolved. The mystery of consciousness is not obviously resolvable in the same way, because more data collection is itself a conscious activity, and the question of why data collection produces subjective experience, why there is something it is like to be an investigator, rather than simply a very complex information processing system that behaves like one, is a question that more data about the brain's information processing doesn't obviously answer. Philosophers call this the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, explaining how the brain processes sensory information, integrates memory, produces behavior, are being progressively resolved by neuroscience. The hard problem, explaining why any of this is accompanied by subjective experience, is not visibly closer to resolution than it was when it was first clearly articulated. We understand more about how the brain works with each passing decade. We don't understand appreciably more about why any of it is experienced. Story 34: Dark Matter. The universe's biggest secret is 27% of everything that exists. Dark matter appears twice in this collection, submitted by different people, which itself says something about how far this particular mystery has penetrated even non-specialist public awareness. The basic situation deserves to be stated clearly. Roughly 27% of the total mass energy content of the observable universe consists of a form of matter that does not emit, absorb, or reflect electromagnetic radiation, and has therefore never been directly detected. It interacts with ordinary matter only through gravity. Everything we have ever seen, touched, measured, built, or been made of, all ordinary matter, constitutes approximately 5% of the universe's total content. Dark matter is more than 5 times more abundant than everything we know about. The evidence for dark matter's existence comes from multiple independent directions, each of which would independently require something playing dark matter's role to explain observations. Galaxy rotation curves require more mass than visible matter provides. Gravitational lensing reveals mass where no visible matter exists. The large-scale structure of the universe, the way galaxies cluster into cosmic filaments, only reproduces in simulations if dark matter is included. The acoustic oscillations visible in the cosmic microwave background encode information only consistent with dark matter's presence in the early universe. The candidate particles, WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles, axions, sterile neutrinos, and various others, have been searched for with progressively more sensitive experiments over decades. None have been detected. Each new generation of experiment sets more stringent limits on where dark matter could be hiding and still not show up. And each successive negative result further constrains the possibilities without revealing what dark matter actually is. 27% of everything. Still completely unknown. Story 35: Flight 19. 5 TBM Avengers that flew into the Bermuda Triangle and kept going on December 5, 1945. 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers departed Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale on a routine training mission designated Flight 19. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles Taylor. All 5 aircraft were lost. A PBM Mariner search and rescue aircraft sent to find them also disappeared. 13 aircraft and 27 men were never recovered. The radio transmissions from the flight during its final hours are genuinely strange and are what keep this case in the mystery category rather than the tragic accident category. Taylor, an experienced pilot who had flown in the Pacific during the war, became apparently convinced that his compasses were malfunctioning and that the flight was somewhere over the Florida Keys, which was inconsistent with where navigation from the departure point would have placed them. Transmissions recorded at the naval station showed Taylor directing his flight on headings that would take them further out to sea if they were actually northeast of Florida over open Atlantic rather than over the Keys, and successive transmissions showed increasing confusion and communication difficulties as daylight faded. The Bermuda Triangle mythology that developed around this case over subsequent decades